Welcome, everyone, to Poets in Conversation. I'm Phyllis Klein. And tonight we have William O'Daly and Terry Ehret, two amazing poets. And we're going to be hearing about poetry written in Spanish, books titled The New Gods and Plagiarisms, among others, Crying at 3 p.m, translations, Fire in Many Forms, Rain Women, and much, much more. So now I'm going to read two poems that I found in the spirit of this reading and in the spirit of poetic connection. The first one is 100 Love Sonnets, number 17 by Pablo Neruda, and it's translated by Mark Eisner. I don't love you as if you were a rose of salt, topaz, or arrow of carnations that propagate fire. I love you as one loves certain obscure things, secretly, between the shadow and the soul. I love you as the plant that doesn't bloom, but carries the light of those flowers hidden within itself. And thanks to your love, the tight aroma that arose from the earth lives dimly in my body. I love you without knowing how or when or from where. I love you directly without problems or pride. I love you like this because I don't know any other way to love, except in this form in which I am not, nor are you, so close that your hand upon my chest is mine, so close that your eyes close with my dreams. And next, we have Love in a Time of Climate Change by Craig Santos Perez, with an epigraph that says, recycling Pablo Neruda's Sonnet 17. I don't love you as if you were rare earth minerals, conflict diamonds, or reserves of crude oil that cause war. I love you as one loves the most vulnerable species, urgently, between the habitat and its loss. I love you as one loves the last seed saved within a vault, gestating the heritage of our roots. And thanks to your body, the taste that ripens from its fruit still lives sweetly on my tongue. I love you without knowing how or when this world will end. I love you organically, without pesticides. I love you like this because we'll only survive in the nitrogen-rich compost of our embrace, so close that your emissions of carbon are mine, so close that your sea rises with my heat. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Terry. I have to find that. Okay. Our first reader, Terry Ehret, is a poet, teacher, translator, and one of the founders of 16 Rivers Press. She has published 4 collections of poetry, most recently Night Sky Journey. Literary awards include the National Poetry Series California Book Award, Pablo Neruda Poetry Prize, Northern California Book Award for California Poetry and Translation, and an NEA Translation Fellowship. She's currently working on bilingual edition of the collected published poems of Mexican poet Ulalumi Gonzalez de Leon. And I just wanted to show you, this is the book that won the prize and the translations of Ulalumi. And then this is her other book that I have. Okay. Okay. From 2004 to 2006, she served as the Poet Laureate of Sonoma County, where she lives and teaches. She enjoys hiking, cross-country skiing, and kayaking in the Sierras, where she and her husband have a tiny A-frame cabin. If the powers of wind and fire have spared it, which so far they have. And when COVID subsides, she will once again lead summer travel writing trips in Ireland, Wales, and Tuscany. So we look forward to booster shots and doing that. She's going to read a little from Plagiarisms, the translations with two other authors of the work of Ulalume Gonzalez de Leon, which recently won the Northern California Book Award for translation. And then she'll also read from other books of hers and translations. And with that, Terry, I welcome you.
Thank you, Phyllis, for that introduction. And I'm going to make an effort to, I don't know if that's visible.
Oh, thank you.
The Full Moon Herald. This is Phyllis's book of poems, and highly recommend it. So if you don't yet have it, perhaps Phyllis will tell us how it's possible to order this book.
Thank you.
I am going to begin reading three short poems by Ulalume Gonzalez de Leon. She's a Mexican poet who passed away in 2009. And I've been working with John Johnson, who is here among the participants today, and our co-translator, Nancy Morales, to bring out Ulalume's collected published poems in English. And she is an enigmatic poet, experimental in many ways, at least in the 70s and 80s when she was doing most of her writing and publishing. She was stepping outside the box as often as she could, I guess maybe kicking the boxes away entirely. One of the characteristics of Ulalume Gonzalez de Leon's writing is her relationship to language itself, and the idea that that there may be a language that we all share, but it's a nonverbal language or a pre-verbal language. And the first poem I'm going to read, I will read it twice because it's really short, is called Word. Spoken word, so alone, so naked. Go back to wearing the unsayable. Spoken word, so alone, so naked. Go back to wearing the unsayable. The second poem of hers I'm going to read is called Skin Changes. Every day I change my face and throw out the previous one that barely has a day of use. But the new faces are getting older. They hardly last the day. I fear sometimes they will break before nightfall. And the third poem from volume 1 of Plagios, Plagiarisms, is difficult safekeeping of the treasure inside. Ulalume often plays with rewriting existing texts, including nursery rhymes and fairy tales. Difficult safekeeping of the treasure inside. The sleeper won't always wake with a kiss, and a whole army of princes could let their kisses fall drop by drop into her dream. but she would feign a deeper sleep, her vulva and eyelids covered with cobwebs. Intent, impassive, surface of ice, blue and indifferent. This difficult beauty camouflages her most violent roses. But someone comes closer to her ear and whispers words and more words. And then, shameless as the blush of a girl, the colors rise, weaving the surface of love. And the sleeper, without her treasure inside, opens her legs like a courtesan. All right, now a few of my own poems. See if I can pull them up. I'm interested in reading work that I've produced in the last, say, year and a half, 2 years. A couple of poems stretch back a little further, but poems that have been written really in a time of crisis, because I find it really hard to write when circumstances like wildfire and drought and climate change and COVID are, threatening at the door. So a few poems do address this crisis, but I just wanted to put it out there that this is a very difficult creative time for me. I know for many people, the crisis brings out their creativity, and it does sometimes for me, but it can be a struggle. The first poem is called Waking in Fire Season. Remember when you waken to be still. Whatever dream you have been wearing in the dark body of sleep still lies near. A deep fold of pleasure, a sleeve of old trouble, a name on a grave. Leave the dream clothes under your skin that now you wash and lotion and paint. Dress slowly for the day just dawning in the smoky east. Remember from time to time to touch the prayer fringe of dream fragments as you walk down the path under the falling sycamore leaves. Remember the sound they make, rattling all night in the wind. The second poem is sort of an evocation of rain. We all need to be writing, I think, rain poems, snow poems, poems to restore this fertile land. This is after a poem by Robinson Jeffers, who described a similar image in a different part of the world. And the first time I ever saw what he described in his poem, I was at Tour House near Pacific Grove in California. Rain women. I saw them once off the coast of Monterey, the rain women, walking across the sky in a slow procession, each carrying the low and heavy sky, each carrying an urn of air and ash. I saw them again in the canyonlands of southern Utah, miles away out over the New Mexico desert. The sky, a black hand of approaching storm. The air between them singed with blue light. Their long gray dresses billowing, shifting, disappearing. reforming high above the Escalante. The walking rain, someone called them, carrying on their heads the dark and weighted sky, carrying in their arms the memory of their dead, the ashes of what wants to be born. And the next poem, oh, by the way, the one I just read, Rain Women, is a prose poem, and I often work in that form. And when I first started translating Ulalume Gonzalez de Leon, I was surprised to discover that in her publications, her poems were lineated, whereas my first experience of her poems, she had arranged them as prose poems. So this next poem is also a prose poem, and it's called Garden Meditation. The hawks cry out, chasing each other above the thin trickle of Thompson Creek. The fruitless plums just losing their leaves. The hawks chase each other under the contrails of an autumn blue sky. I look up, but can't see them, the beauty of their wings. Then again, the cry, but from a different angle of their world above my life. What if I saw my life as they do? Flashes of colored clothing under the leaves, locked to the earth, graceless, unresponsive to wind, navigating alone without a current, a small boat plowing its course from garden to kitchen to garden. Lonely boat. No wonder the hawks cry. I spent some years teaching, well, I'd not say I could teach it, but leading a group of writers with me on a journey through Dante's Divine Comedy. And this next poem begins with an epigraph from Dante's Paradiso, Canto 33, the very last lines of that canto. Scattered leaves. I saw within its depths how it conceives all things in a single volume bound by love, of which the universe is the scattered leaves. Why is it I've come to the edge like a loose leaf page? What wind sent the leaves scattering through the universe? How will I know the word when I find it, falling from the firestorm like scorched edges of the sky onto the dry grass of a friend's field? Why did the fiery hand touch here and here, and not this hillside of harebell, lupin, yellow sorrel? Blooms of lavender shiver with lusty bees, as if the earth were not a grave of ashes. Why is this repetition so unsettling? Nature's ecstasy of rhyme. When I come to the edge, breathless from the climb, whose blue-eyed grass do I surrender to? Trespass. And this next one is set in Half Moon Bay, which is on the California coast. Many of you know it, and many of you would also know that in the spring, the wild mustard dominates the landscape there. And this poem was written after one by Lucille Clifton. Hers was called Let There Be New Flowering. mustard bathing at Half Moon Bay. First blue in weeks, and the flowering mustard sings its sweet seduction in the fields all along the ragged Pacific edge. Grown men have pulled onto the shoulder of the highway, needing the tender touch of yellow. They walk in slow time, arms outstretched, smiling as if our long war were over, as if all sides had won. Come, walk the deep paths to the sun, be ready. Something inside wants to mend. And the last poem I'm going to read, very quirky, but in addition to translating, where one does try to get as close as possible to the literal meaning of the poem, but of course, poems have all levels of meaning besides that literal. But I also engage in something called mistranslation or homophonic translation. And the idea is to take a poem from a language, preferably one you don't know, and sound out the words to the best of your ability and let the sound of the words evoke a new poem. It's a good way to get out of if you're kind of stuck in your own patterns of thought and language choice. This homophonic translation is a very useful device. The poem I'm going to read is about translation, about actual translation, but it was inspired by an Anglo-Saxon riddle. And those of you who might be familiar with Anglo-Saxon poetry know that much of it is in something called the Exeter Book. This is riddle number 47 from the Exeter Book. I do have it in the original Old English, which I could possibly share if you're interested. So it's a poem about translation, but it's a mistranslation of a poem. And the original riddle was about a bookworm. Translation inspired by riddle number 47 from the Exeter Book. The word moans, frets, puts me to prayer, tonguing and licking each uttered syllable, each a wonder gift, each a writhing snake in the brittle grass of summer. Then it's gone in a burst of flame, the wild and primal fire, strange country of silence, strange ghost of was, where the air burns white and the hem of each word shimmers. I did see someone posted in chat that'd like to see that Old English. Let me see if I can do that.
Oh, that'd be great. And there's a comment. Oh, thank you, Terry. Thank you so much. I wanted to say how your voice and the way that you read the poetry is equally it enhances and the beauty of your writing. So thank you so much for that.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm going to play around to see if I can get the Old English up on the screen. But and if you have any initial questions, or maybe we want to go right to Bill's reading. What's your preference?
Yeah, I just want to say a few things because
Great.
And then if Bill could also come in and talk a little bit about what we just heard, and then we'll move on to William's poetry. So yeah, I was just thinking about some of the words that you choose and the images. especially the fire poems. Uh, how will I know the word when I find it falling from the firestorm of scorched edges of the sky? Um, it's just so evocative. And you're saying that you wrote that after the fires, um, not while they were happening. Is that right?
That poem was written actually. I was sitting with my writing workshop, and we were meeting at my house because the world around us was on fire, and
Mm.
we had to meet in Petaluma, which was relatively safe, um, relatively. So it was actually in the midst of the first firestorm we had in 2017.
Yeah, really, it captures it for sure. And then we have a few comments here. So Ed writes, Justine Fixell was a great source of mixed information and made Lawrence, her husband, laugh. So I'm not sure I understand. I don't know who Justine Fixell was. Do you, Terry? Or
I think we're talking about the wife of Lawrence Fixell, who was a extraordinarily fine poet and prose poet. And 16 Rivers Press, which is the publishing company that I work with. We're a collective. One of our members was the literary executor of the Fixell estate. And so we were very pleased to be able to bring out his collected prose and poetry. So that may be the reference here, the connection.
Yeah, Ed can tell us more about that later. Yeah. And then Shauna says, fabulous, Terry. Love all your translations and even more your poetry. Yum, yum, yum. I agree. um, and then John says, in Rain Woman, there's the phrase, the ashes of something waiting to be born. This makes me think of the phoenix rising from its ashes. Are the Rain Women reimagining this myth, turning it around? So you might want to answer that now, or you could answer it a little and we could talk about it more later too.
Mm-hmm. I can't say where the mind leaps imaginatively, especially when we let go of the reins of conscious control. So I was not, as I wrote the poem, thinking of the phoenix, but thinking really of the shape between these these shafts of rain and the urn shape. And so for me, urns would be a place to hold ashes. So it was, I guess, a little more pedestrian than, but it's just the leaping imagination, trying to follow it as quick as I can.
Yeah, the different ways that we can then take it and interpret it too. So, yeah. So just so, William, do you have anything more you want to add right now, or should we go to your poems? Yeah, you need to unmute.
He's muted.
Yeah,
I am muted. Well, not anymore.
Not for long.
I've released myself. I've been a fan of Terry's poetry since Copper Canyon published Lost Body as a result of Terry winning National Poetry Series. And there's a lot I could say, but one thing that Terry's poetry reminds me of is a title of a book, The Delicacy and Strength of Lace. And it's a book of letters between James Wright and Leslie Marmon Silko. And there are lines that really stand out to me. I love Terry's relationship to her poems as speaker of her poems. There's both a meditativeness, a thoughtfulness, a humility, but also I always feel like I'm on solid ground no matter what she's speaking of. A good example from the poem Waiting in Fire Season. Remember from time to time, I have it right here, I pulled it out. Remember from time to time to touch the prayer fringe of dream fragments as you walk down the path under the falling sycamore leaves. And it's such a gorgeous image, and there's a sense of process, and yet it's you could almost hang that image on a wall, and it would guide you. It would guide your eye, and yeah, it's very strong and resonates, and this, since I first read this has hung with me, without fail. And so, and I also, I've read a lot of poetry recently, American poetry recently, and subscribed to various poems of the day and such. And I'm all the more impressed with Terry, and grateful for the way she writes. I've been, I'll just say it, you don't want to define things in terms of, what you don't like, but there's so much solipsism in poetry right now. The self is all there is, and it's so confining, no matter what the image is, no matter what the narrative in the poem. And a lot of them are very narrative, very talky. There's this quiet lyricism in Terry's poetry that always, pulls me along and and yet treats me well.
Oh, just beautifully said. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and I can tell from the comments in the chat that we're going to have an amazing discussion after you read, William. So,
well, thank you, William, for what you have said, and for being a friend of my poetry way back at the beginning of my writing career with the publication of Lost Body.
It's been my pleasure, Terry. You bet.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. So, so let me now introduce William O'Daly, another treasure for us to listen to today. William O'Daly has translated 8 books of the late career and posthumous poetry of Chilean Nobel laureate Pablo Neruda, and most recently Neruda's first volume, Book of Twilight, a finalist for the 2018 Northern California Book Award in translation. O'Daly's chapbooks of poems include The Whale in the Web, The Road to Isla Negra, Waterways, which is a collaboration with JS Graustein, and Yarrow and Smoke. A National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, he was a finalist for the 2006 Quill Award in Poetry, and in September of 2021, received the American Literary Award from the bilingual Korean American journal Miju Poetry and Poetics. And I have to say, being at that ceremony, that was really cool. He has received national and regional honors for literary editing and instructional design, and served on the National Board of Poets Against War. A lifelong hiker, particularly in the Sierra Nevada and along the California coast, he flows wherever lakes and rivers speak his name. And I want to add that he works for the California Department of Water Resources, and is the lead writer for the California Water Plan. Very important work. And now I'd like to hand things over to you, William.
Well, Phyllis, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I enjoy that job, I gotta say. Water's all over my poetry, so I figured I might as well make my living trying to take good care of it. I'm gonna read 5 poems today. 2 of mine, 2 of Neruda's from Book of Twilight, Crepusculario, which was Neruda's first book. After doing all those late and posthumous books, I went around to the beginning and did his first at Copper Canyon Press's invitation. And then I'm going to go back and read another one of mine for Neruda. All 3 of my poems will be from my new manuscript, The New Gods. Phyllis I got the award, the American Literary Award, for the original version of For Neruda, which came out in the chapbook, The Road to Isla Negra. And Phyllis was at the ceremony, as she mentioned, and asked me to read it tonight. And but this is a second version, and it's in the manuscript. And it's a little bit shorter. It's a longish poem, so I'm going to just read 5. This first poem, A Summer Prayer, takes place at the confluence of the North and Middle Fork of the American River, which I live about 5-10 minutes from, and where I spend a lot of time. So much is going on in terms of drought and fire and mining, gold mining. This is gold mining territory. We still have miners up in the hills panning for gold. They're not placer mining anymore, thankfully. But at any rate, it's meant a lot to me, the history, which you can still see, although with what's going on climactically and otherwise, this poem came out of the sense that we're losing this visible history of the indigenous tribes that lived in the area. And it also is very much about a sense of birth and rebirth on my part. A summer prayer. With the evening mist, I settle on a blackened and blasted boulder at the confluence. The river's psalm encants the flesh of the spirit, the dance of the extinct. Dust of acorns survives in bedrock holes with the dying thunder, with the last breath. I plunge into a bitter pool of the North Fork. Pulse quickens. A single thought escapes like trout. Blood departs the arms and the legs for the heart. Inner tides release uncertainty to the extremities, longing that flares out of reach. The river choreographs how I change, how I abide when the current takes me. In the dusk, I stroke hard toward the bank and rise like an icy moon along the forgotten path. This next poem, the experience of it happened quite a while ago when I was working in the Artists in Schools program in Montana, specifically the Poets in the Schools. I was about 2/3 of the way through the year, and my cabin on Rock Creek, this blue ribbon trout fishing stream where I lived about 20 miles east of Missoula, burned down. A friend left a cigarette burning that I didn't see. And so I moved into Missoula with another poet in the program, a friend of mine. He and his girlfriend put me up for the remainder of my contract. And I'm walking down the street one day, and I encounter 3 students I had taught in one of the Missoula schools. And we had a conversation. It was really interesting because I felt they were the wise ones. They were the sages. And our conversation kept missing. But then came together at the end. And this isn't quite literally the conversation, but it does represent it. The first 4 lines are me speaking. The next 4 lines are the students, and we alternate. Come out of the house. The epigraph. They will say you are on the wrong road, if it is your own. Antonio Porcia. Before the house burns down, open your eyes to the rain and the owl. In the plaza, a soldier is smoking. The elm puts on new leaves. My daddy doesn't want me to be any artist, not even a rancher like him. His sweat goes to deadbeats, like the cattle in the songs. I still have that part of me, fire transformed. Is it wrong for a man to cry at 3 in the afternoon? Poet, don't you know fire makes you young, gives you something real to fear? In my pocket, I carry the jawbone of an ass. I learn virtue, planting myself among the delphinium. Poet, feel the flames at your feet. Feel this ground, like water in the earth. Spring is demolishing the dead. Wrapping myself in the sun's ribbons, I am learning to be young, delirious among the ruins at 3 in the afternoon. Why do you keep fighting, poet? Sharing pain and joy in difficult times. Is it the ashes collecting on your teeth? Why are so few born at 3 in the afternoon? Why do I die? Are words bitter seed or fierce anemone? Weapons or prayers? Poet, what is your favorite color of kite? Why are words never what they seem? Falling eyes, rising mouths, charging bulls or smoke. Will you remain on the earth or flee like a lost river, an archaeologist chasing the stars? Okay, now we'll move to Don Pablo. Again, these two poems are from Crepusculario, or Book of Twilight. He published the book when he was 19 years old in Santiago. He had arrived in Santiago at age 16 from Temuco, which was at the edge of the frontier, Mapuche territory. He was a small town kid with an enormous vision and a great passion. And when he arrived, it was Gabriela Mistral, the first Nobel Prize laureate, Chile, who mentored him and said, if you want to be a poet, go to a cultural center like Santiago and meet people and grow. And so that's what he did. And here is these two poems, shortest poems, are very much his opening when he arrived, represent his opening when he arrived in Santiago and lived there for a while. Poem in 10 verses. My heart was a wing, alive and roiled, and a frightening wing of longing. Spring was in the green fields. The heights were blue and the ground emerald. She, the one who loved me, died in spring. I remember still her eyes of sleepy dove. She, the one who loved me, closed her eyes. Evening, blue countryside evening, evening of wings and flights. She, the one who loved me, died in spring and carried the spring to the sky. And this poem is called Here I Am with My Poor Body. He had quite a spiritual sense at a very young age. Here I am with my poor body facing the twilight that dyes the golden reds, the evening sky. Here I am with my poor body facing the twilight that dyes with golden reds the evening sky. While amid the mist, the dark trees free themselves and leave to dance in the streets. I don't know why I'm here, nor when I came, nor why the red light of the sun fills everything. It's enough to feel my sad body facing the immensity of a gold-tinted sky, the immense redness of a sun that no longer exists, the immense corpse of a land already dead, and facing the astral lights that color the sky, the immensity of my soul beneath the immense evening. I began in some seriousness writing poetry when I was 19. Neruda had already published his first book and to much acclaim. Now we're back to my work. This poem is for Neruda. In 2008, I visited Chile finally. I didn't go earlier because of the Pinochet regime, the coup, the dictatorship. As a Neruda translator, it would have been inconsiderate to put hosts in Chile in such a position. So I didn't go then. And then in the 90s, I was extremely busy and didn't go much of anywhere, had a lot going on. And then I thought my 8th and last Neruda book, World's End, Fin de Mundo, would truly be my last. And I had told myself that three previous times. But at any rate, thinking it would be my last book, and then I did Book of Twilight afterwards, so there goes that. But I didn't want to write the introduction to the last Neruda book before having spent time in Chile. So I went in 2008, spent 3 weeks in Chile, 8 days and 8 nights on Easter Island, Rapa Nui, where the second Neruda book I translated is set, The Separate Rose. And it was the most eye-opening experience of my life, both Chile and Rapa Nui. I was so impressed by the way I met with, it was also a human rights tour. I was exploring the results of the dictatorship with a couple of artists who acted as guides to some of these horrific places. But I was really impressed by how no matter where folks were who I met with along the political spectrum, and I went pretty far left and almost scarily far right. And I say scarily far right because even folks there would say, Pablo Neruda, I am so grateful to him for having spread Chilean culture across the world. But he was a communist. I'd get whiplash, but I don't think you'd hear that much in this country, and I never have, about our poets. So it was, the gratitude was almost overwhelming at times for Neruda. I was treated very well. People said, oh, everything's going so good because Pablo's looking out for you, and which I felt was true. And anyway, this poem, a lot of this poem takes place when he went into exile in the late 40s and into the early 50s. And while he was writing Canto General, his first of 2 great book-length poems. For Neruda, ride your pale horse through the meadow tonight, among the black skirts of the sky. Bring into your hands the exiled light, the litanies of broken glass and bone. We will hide you in the flower garden, in the closet when the police close in. You will lie under a blanket in the back seat of the sedan headed south, and later climb into the Andes, your typewriter stuffed in a saddlebag. As your exposed heart opens to the waterfall, to the river of shattered hands, your two vaquero guides will roll their eyes. On reaching the pass, you will barely notice the goats perched above, staring at you stripped down to the man you are, who no longer searches for his scars, his country, artifacts, women, the daughter who died with the house of flowers, the brother buried at night, where farmers still dig for water. Pablo, tie your horse to the night. Sit with me in the lost city on a patio ringed by geraniums and the quiet hills, before the dawn arrests our sense of beauty. In an hour, the river will run with the color of blood. You will listen for green rain falling through the dense kilometers, speak to snow in the mountains, discover gratitude in fields where women search a shard of bone, the back of a skull, empty as a womb, a foot still in its shoe. The youngest son preserved in the dry earth, where politicians hide their silences, their words, their money belts, gunpowder and disease. Let me pour you sparkling wine stirred with the juice of pomegranates. Offer handfuls of mountain blueberries, a ladle brimming with olive oil to drizzle over onion and tomato on crusty bread. Then a poem of friendship, some woolen socks, the bonfire, and a guitar. Ride your weary horse from the assaulted coast. Rest on beds of Mexican salvia, African daisies, delphinium, where the Greek gods wrote love letters to the creatures who save us from ourselves. What can we say to the ruined star? Brother of my breath, how can we sing, any of us? How will we remember to live for nothing? How are we to laugh as we scatter petals over your ashes? I never saw you cry, but do my best to let your words weep, to play simply, to flow like the blood of the children, to sweat the gifts of the body and presume the soul. Ride your horse where the dead and the living rise from their graves. Witness the tombs opening, the vertical stones falling, the guiding eye colliding with vision and belief. Around us, in churches and mosques, the innocent are falling, praying lavishly and alone. The river that carries us succumbs to concrete and steel. The words you shouted for beautiful Victor on your deathbed, the taunts as he died at the hands of the torturers. Words so brutal, so ugly, they take the breath away. Thousands are leaving their apartments and entering La Avenida de la Paz, lined by Chile's own Guardia Civil. Machine guns and batons, but no one gives a damn. Thousands join the procession to the general cemetery, scattering flowers over your casket. An eagle glides and tilts toward the coast, heading perhaps for an empty nest. We all have arrived, the living and the dead, shouting, Pablo Neruda, presente! Return to Isla Negra. Matilde will warm a meal in the splendor. Empty bottles and poems, like roots, will wash up on the shore, returning all you have given. Conspire with me among the hills, the black oak and the vines. Let me plant a kiss of salt on your forehead. Let us free ourselves, and with a single throat, praise the summer grass. keep time with the dancer who flares in the first dark hour before the Perseid streak across the emptiness. Thank you.
Let's everybody unmute now, yeah? And give these two poets a big welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
And I really thank you both so much. I feel like there's so much wisdom and so many amazing people in our audience. So I want to try to open things up so you all can ask questions and make comments, and of course we'll be able to do the same. So so does anybody have something they've been wanting to say since we've been on mute, or something you want to put in the chat? Hiram says, William, thanks for the Delphinium gift of your poems.
Thank you so much. You're quite welcome.
I second that. My favorite flowers, and I love that they showed up twice in the poems that you read today. I want to thank William for his metaphors. They function for me like doors and windows onto other worlds. And once the metaphor has entered the poem is dramatically changed. I'm thinking specifically of at the end of the poem, A Summer Prayer, rise like an icy moon. And in that beautiful for Neruda poem, litanies of broken glass and bone, river of shattered hands. It's just, there's such a potency and intimacy in those metaphors.
Thank you so much, Terry. I can't tell you how much that means to me coming from you. Thank you so much.
And Carolyn says, thanks, William. Glad you got to Chile, such a land of poets.
Oh.
Yeah.
Got a few.
And Sandy has something.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say, I loved hearing you read together, Bill and Terry. Your poetry, it's like your poetic cousins. There's a lot of shared family there. And I really felt that today. I mean, I realized it before, but I really felt it today. Also, thanks so much for, making Neruda a household word. I've been bringing Neruda to my students now for about 5 years, and it's just fabulous how they understand him and can take that into their own writing. So, and Terry, thank you for the Half Moon Bay poem. That's always one I will always love. Beautiful reading.
Thank you, Sandy.
I wanted to say something to both of you. I've never tried to translate anything. And listening to both of you, I was thinking, what an incredible act of love translation is for the poets that you are translating, to get inside their words, to sometimes borrow their words and then make them your own. But I just thought it was tremendous. I love listening to both of you and those gorgeous works. Hi, Terry. We know each other from way back in Poets in the Schools.
Poets in the Schools, and I was delighted to hear that William also worked as a poet in the schools.
Right.
A wonderful organization, bringing poetry to students, but also drawing it so brilliantly from them.
As does also Sandra, who's here today.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, I think, Perry, why not translate or mistranslate? You could do either one,
I just have never thought of doing it, but I read something interesting about the translations of Basho. And I was researching Basho for some reason recently, and I came across this article that said that one haiku of his about the pond, the frog jumping in the pond, had been, it's only 3 lines, has been translated 150 different ways. I mean, I would always be afraid of, you know, misinterpreting the poet, you know, or anyway, I just thought, you know, I think it takes courage and incredible love and just how you immerse yourself into their lives and their words. I just think it's fabulous. It was
Thank
a
you.
very rich
And if
experience.
John Johnson wants to jump in here as one of my co-translators, a partner in this, it is an extraordinary intimacy that happens in translation, and all translation involves interpretation. And every time you revisit a poem you've translated, you know, ache to change something and do it another way, or try something new. So it's a real enhancement of one's own writing in many ways. I found that to be true. I never intended to be a translator. I just happen to love some poets who wrote in languages other than English, like Eugenio Montale and Gabriela Mistral, Neruda, of course, Octavio Paz, and Ulalume González de León. So I found myself a translator kind of almost by accident.
I was just going to say, Perry, the idea that to translate, you know, you're inhabiting that poet that you're translating. I wonder, both Terry and Bill, do you ever, in writing your own poetry, do you ever hear or feel the presence of Ulalume, Terry, or Pablo Neruda, Bill, as you're working on your own poem? Do they come and visit you?
Yeah, that's a real interesting question, John. I first started translating Neruda when I was 19, but just totally for practice. As a practice as a poet. I was studying with Kenneth Rexroth. He was a kind of mentor, and he was, as I'm sure many of you know, a very prolific translator as well as poet. And he told us, he taught a class called World Poetry. And it was just that. Most of it was cited by him. And he'd say, you know, you young students, you young poets, you really need to translate. It'll create greater breadth, depth, and scope in your work, and it'll give you longevity as a poet. It'll keep you growing. And also, it's a service to your own culture. And so, John, for a number of years, I just translated just for that reason. Didn't even try and publish any of the poems. And I think I've been doing it for so long that I don't feel Neruda's presence when I'm writing my work. Of course, I did in For Neruda. I summoned him. Hey, come on over here. But when I'm translating him, I very much feel his presence. I think I don't feel his presence when I'm writing my poems because I've so integrated him, his voice, his images, and all. And I think we, in terms of sensibility, have a lot in common, even though we never met. 2 different countries. I've had friends, poets, tell me that. Well, it's a natural you're writing him because your work is a lot like his. So thanks. But that's what I would say. It's just there. Great question.
How about you, Terry?
Well, I've first read Ulalume González de León in English only. It was in an anthology of an international anthology edited by Michael Benedict. Many of you may know that book. And her poems just, they struck me so deeply. There was something about the way she worked with scientific language and philosophical language and language theory and this musical lyricism and sensuality all at the same time. And I just said, my God, I want to do that. I may have already had that inclination before reading her, but certainly she was, her work led me into the kind of poetry that I've been writing pretty much all my poetic life. And there's a lovely story about how she really did step into my life and call me to be her translator. Another time for that story, perhaps. But someone mentioned that it's kind of spooky when a poet, when is translating, seems to be very present. And she's definitely there whenever we're translating her. Her essence is there, no doubt about it.
I would like to say something about that, if it's okay.
Yeah, please do.
It was exactly the reflection that I had, the train of thoughts listening to both of you, Terry and Bill. That there is really this immense act of love when you translate poetry, but I think that the love that we receive back unwillingly is just as much, if not more, because the pollination of the author that we translate is unavoidable and is extremely powerful. And Bill, I was listening to your poem for Neruda for the second time, which is very fortunate for me because I need to hear a poem a huge number of times. And this time, it struck me like this hymn of gratitude. I really received it that way and very strongly. And I thought that you really, for me, that poem is a kind of thank you. And, it seemed like it would be Neruda that has to thank you, I'm sure, but you thank them. And that's the way I received it. So that was one reflection. And the other was that I'm usually very disturbed when poet read the poetry of someone else, because for me, the voice, the organ, is the biggest signifier. And so I feel that when I hear the poetry of someone else, translated or not translated, just read into the voice of a different poet, something happens that troubles me very much. So for that reason, I had extremely highlighted attention to both of you to see if I could really organically perceive the difference between what the translated work and your own work. And I perceived it very strongly. I really sensed that you didn't project your own voice, poetic voice, in the translation, that the difference was extremely neat, and even the way you voiced it physically maintained that strong difference. And I think that is very rare and very beautiful. So I'm grateful for that.
Tony, that's a
Thank you.
wonderful insight. I've never heard anyone express that. I mean, it's been on my mind. When I go to read, actually, as a much younger poet, it came to mind to me, and I made sure that I somehow kept a Neruda persona, that I felt his sensibility, not my own, when I was reading. And so that you would say this is remarkable to me. Really, literally, no one has ever expressed anything like that to me.
That is really beautiful. Thank you.
I had an interesting experience when I was are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. When I was reading some of these poems, in fact, I think it was the same three that I read to you today. I read on a podcast, and then I sent the link to Ulalume's daughter, Berenice Gonzalez de Leon. Berenice has been extremely important in bringing this work into published form. But she had a difficult relationship with her mom, and she said it was very freeing for her to hear her mother's poems in my voice, because it kind of separated out the difficult personal connection that made it hard to hear her mother's poetry. And it was not so much the voice inherent in the poem, but my actual physical voice was so different from her mother's, and it was coming from a different personality, and anyway, that was very interesting to hear that from Berenice.
Wow. Yeah. In the chat, Courtney says translating keeps the dance of the extinct moving in the present tense. That's beautiful.
I
And
love
then,
that.
yeah. And then Carolyn Wright says, poets thanking poets. So important to be receptive like this and grateful for what comes. Thanks. And actually, I had a couple of questions. I'm going to combine them. I hope I hope I can ask it in an intelligent enough form. So two things so before we do these readings, I got together with Terry and Bill, and we talk, and I try to get to know a little more about how the reading's gonna flow. And so one of the things that Terry said when we were when we were talking, you made a comment about native language. You said, "What is our native language?" And that there was more to say about that. So I wanted to just open that up for us all to talk about. And then the other thing was, which maybe it's not even that much the same, but I thought it might fit into the same question, is that, Bill, what you said about everything is a translation, and so that actually, I got so excited about that, I rushed to write a poem about that, which I'm still working on, but I thought that was really interesting as well, in terms of, so those two things: what is our native language, and what is a translation, really, or everything is a translation. So yeah, I just thought I could open that up, and we could play around with that a little bit. Do you want to comment on that, or?
Well, I can say something about my sense that that I have a native language that is preverbal or nonverbal, and it's probably the language that I use when I dream, and certainly there's a dream logic, a dream language that we access, but that's what I think I'm often trying to translate from that preverbal or nonverbal language and poetry comes very close. It can come very close because it doesn't ask the regular rational logic of us. It's open to other kinds of leaps and changes. So that's what I think of whenever I'm writing a poem that I'm translating. And that was the premise of, I don't know if you can see, Translations from the Human Language was my second book of poems. And that's what I was trying to get at in that book, though its title is very enigmatic. What the heck is that human language? But it seems like perhaps William understands that in thinking that everything is a kind of translation.
I do feel that way very much, Terry. We're always interpreting, even when we say something very literal. Summer sure is warm, you know, we're interpreting not so much each word, but the impulse to say it, the moods, the emotions behind it, and only greet each other, you know. Yeah. How you doing, John? I'm cool. We interpret. We have similar sets of experiences. We experience this world together, but we experience it in our own individual ways. And we go to talk about it. In poetry, we try and use emotionally precise language, language that provides emotional precision, emotions that don't really have a name, single name. And so they need to be encapsulated in metaphor, embodied in metaphor, allegory, whatever it is. And it was interesting. George Steiner's wonderful book on translation, big thick volume, After Babel. He has a lot of fun with this. What does he call it? Something like vignette. He says, you know, originally, like in the Garden of Eden, men and women spoke the same language, understanding each other perfectly. But after the fall, language divided them. And, you know, taking the difference in gender and where we experience things, the way we communicate differently. Deborah Tannen has done a few decades of really interesting research, especially for, I think, poets, on how men and women communicate differently. And so, but men communicate differently among themselves, and there is no perfect understanding, but which puts the premium on how we listen. So as a translator, it's really, really important to listen well, to listen kind of outside yourself. What I used to do, first few books of Neruda, I would read the original into a tape recorder. And then I'd play the original poems, myself reading the original poems back to myself, so that I would get the music embedded within my body. It worked really well. And then for the later books, I stopped doing that because it stopped being necessary, because I learned to listen in that way by reading the poems, reading them aloud to myself without needing a recording to hear it back. And with Neruda, you know, music is so important that it was also a very, very good thing to do.
Thank you. So I'm just curious. I'm curious about our time, and if people. There's a question here from John Johnson, and I'm just wondering how the time is working for people, because one thing we've been doing is closing out the reading, and then if people want to stay and talk afterwards, we can do it that way. So, but we can also keep it open now. It just kind of depends on what your energy is in the room. So would you like to stay and talk some more, or shall we? What are people's energies? Yeah, thumbs up from Terry. Yeah, anybody else? Thumbs up. Okay, great. All right. Well, so here we go. John asks, or says, the translator John Feistner wrote that the early stage of translating a poet is inevitably marked by too much fealty, word for word or sense for sense renderings that stop short of exploiting the translator's own tongue. Would you agree with this, Terry and Bill?
I would agree. I would agree. A year, 4 or 5 years. No, what am I saying? 3 years after I studied with Rex Roth, I was living in Modesto, and I'd come back to California from Denver, and where we founded Copper Canyon Press. And I was studying with Philip Levine at Cal State Fresno. And one day, you know, in the workshop, he throws up his hands and says, "You young poets, you're so full of yourselves. Why don't you not bring one of your poems, but bring a translation next week?" And, you know, and he said a little bit more about that. And so I went to the Stanislaus Library and Stanislaus County Library and found a little book called Aum by Neruda that I didn't know. I thought I knew all of Neruda's books. So I took it home and thought, well, I might as well translate the first poem in the book and take it next week. And even though I had already translated Neruda just as a practice quite a bit, somehow I got very literal, very literal. 2 reasons. One, I was trying to be faithful, but I was being faithful to the individual words, not to the poem that the words embody. And the other thing is it was really difficult. I got a new introduction to Neruda. The poem was really difficult. And so I didn't really have the chops to bring the poem within over. I ended up publishing that book 7 years later. I did the whole thing and went through at least 3 major revisions with it, and you know, got my legs. But I think that's where we go, the surface of the poem, when we're just trying to, you know, row the boat and not drown in the original poem. Some people just translate that way, but it's rarely successful.
Well, I am fairly new to translating. I've been working on this project for about 8 years now, but that's not that long in a literary career. So I would say that I do struggle with wanting to be faithful to the literal meaning of the poem and wanting to be faithful to something larger than that. And I guess it's fortunate that I have translation partners and other people who lend a hand at this, because I can get stuck in one way of translating and someone else can come in with a whole lot of, like John, for example, who's often done a great deal of research and background into the references. Ulume's work is called Plagiarisms, and that's what she does often. She takes texts from other writers, and kind of tracing those texts down reveals often what she's up to in a particular poem. So I benefit from having co-translators, and so we can lift off the literal and explore other layers of meaning. But I also am cautious about putting it into my own tongue, because I think you can lose something of the author's original voice that way. So, there again, I would say that having translation partners is a huge advantage.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Can I
Go ahead,
interject one
Nina.
thing, Phyllis?
Oh, yeah.
Point something out. 2 things. One, in Lost Body, Ulalume makes an appearance. And so Terry has been with Ulalume for a very long time.
Mm.
And I just wanted to acknowledge that, and from the deep place within Terry that Ulalume arises. And now that John's here, I just want to express again how amazing it is that John, Terry, and is it Anna?
Nancy.
Nancy. I don't know
Nancy
where I got
Morales.
Anna.
That's okay.
It wasn't coming to me, I'm sorry. How they have the patience and the strong will and the ability to collaborate to the point where three people working on a translation lend that translation one voice, one rich, full voice.
Absolutely.
It's really remarkable.
Mhm. Agreed. And yes, thank you. And Myrna?
Yeah, I will have some questions for both of you. But before I go into that, I would just like to say that my native language is Croatian. English is my second language. So, and I started writing poetry very, very late. And I have experience that is a little bit different from yours because of the fact that I was trying to translate my own poetry written in English into Croatian and vice versa. And to say that it's challenging is beyond, it's way more than challenging. And the reason for this, in my personal case, is that I have a difficulty even making up my mind which elements in my poem or which facets of my poetry I really treasure most. One thing I don't have a problem with, which is not a regular problem with translation, is understanding exactly what the author is saying. That obviously that element doesn't exist for me because I'm the translator and the original poet, so that is out. And even so, because of the nature of the two languages that are quite unrelated in this particular case, there are onomatopoeic sounds that are practically impossible to translate from one into the other, which I would love dearly to preserve, because I think that next to music of the poem, just the musicality, the rhythm, the way the thoughts follow, and then the way the words follow, between trying to be faithful to that and between trying to be faithful to the ideas in the poem and the message, if there is one, or whatever spirit there is in that problem, in that poem, they don't simply map precisely. For example, there are many, many words in Croatian that have more than just one meaning. Second meaning, third meaning. They depend on the context. And when I'm translating, let's say, English into Croatian, that gets lost. And sometimes that second or third meaning of a word will be more colorful and more important to the poem than just translation. So my question to you is the following. What do you aim for with most, like this, what are you trying to be most faithful to? The meaning, the spirit, the musicality, the faithfulness to just the words, which, you know, I think that we all know that that's not the idea. But all of the above, what is it that you cherish most? I find that every time I translate my own poems, I actually rewrite a poem. I can't help it because I'm forever dissatisfied with the fruit of my work, and I find myself that I In fact, instead of translating, I'm rewriting. Now, I can afford to do that because I know what I meant. But how do you cope with respecting the original work of the poet and not and refrain from injecting what you like in their work? Okay, so if you can elaborate a little bit on that, I would appreciate it.
What a fascinating question.
Well, it's a fascinating question, and it is the,
yeah, let me just say that after this question, I think I'll read a poem and then we'll close. So yeah, so just to let you know the time frame that we're under.
it is the question of translation, and as far as I am concerned, and I would say all of the above. The poem doesn't exist in any one of those factors, those areas. The poem exists beyond all of them, in the sum of them all, and beyond that. The poem exists when I read a poem and you hear it. Is it Myrna?
Yes.
And you hear it, Myrna, or the other way around, the poem exists within me, within my sense. And so we can't really know, the poem goes where the sounds of the poem go, where the words of the poem go. And so what I do, especially with Neruda, who is so musical, and plays so much with Spanish, is I'll do a literal draft, what they call a crib or a trot, and I will, in many places, note alternative translations of words, of lines, of phrases, and just start playing. And as I said earlier, really pay attention to the music. Feel as though the music is somewhere within me by the time I do that. Even that first draft. And then it's a whole bunch of difficult choices. But I guess what I would say in translating Neruda in particular is when a very difficult choice seems to have no conclusion, no perfect conclusion.
That's it.
I go with the music. The music, I will let the music lead me, as long as it's not, how I'm hearing the music. As long as I don't let it lead me astray, I hope. But that's very much where I will go, in part because that's a belief of mine in translation, but particularly with Neruda, whose music is there to guide you.
Thank you. I'm well aware that we are all shooting for all of the above. I just wanted to know what the emphasis for you, where the emphasis lies, and you have answered it. So I happen to feel the same way, but I'm not so sure that everyone does. People have different.
Well, I will add to that it often depends on the poem. Some poems have primarily a sound component to their meaning. Ulalume has a poem called "Words Take a Break from Their Meanings." And while some of the words are real words that have real meanings, that one can translate literally, much of it is sound play. And it took us a while in translating this poem. It was really difficult. We took many goes at that poem to know whether to stay with the sound play or whether to render it into something comparable in English. You learn some of lose some of the sound effects. But we discovered about halfway through the poem that there was a layer of meaning we had missed, which was that this was an erotic poem about oral sex. And so we had to then find a way to bring out the eroticism in the poem when that hadn't been our initial inclination. And I will say that Ululume's daughter asked us specifically to make the poem more erotic in English. So it's not usually what you hear from daughters about their mothers, but that was her request. So it really does depend on the poem, and each poem may have a different some element that rises to the surface as the more important, when all of those elements that Bill articulated are, of course, essential.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you both, and thank everybody. Thank all of you. Yeah, and let me just read this poem, and then we'll close. So this is out of my book, and it's in the weather section. I thought that might be appropriate for what we've been experiencing lately. And it's called "Try Not to Be Afraid of This Drought." And it's an epigraph from Ocean Vuong. The only place I have to hide is inside my poems. So many clouds and the feeling of rain, but nothing pours. Everything shrivels. So dry the earth begs the sky to squeeze a few drops out of its mouth. So dry, trees gasp, roots split into parched cracks. We hide, thirsty inside this poem, only words to drink. Inside this poem, all the fear in the world and all that we lose. Then the oranges, juice dripping, and pomegranates, wild seeds staining. Their tree roots beseech the subterranean lake. So deep, find me, sunken under, water me. So much I've lost under my skin, down in the secret parts of me. Some things no return, but to come, the smell of rain, the rain itself, the tears. So let's pray for rain. Thank you. Yeah, and thank everybody. Yeah, this has been a wonderful, wonderful reading and conversation.